In the autumn of 1994, in a quiet community in Illinois, a young woman went missing without warning. But no one could explain what happened, and police found no evidence, and the case quickly went cold. More than 24 years later, one small detail reopened the case. What they found shocked everyone, and it exposed a dark secret that changed everything forever. The quiet town of Oak Creek. Oak Creek was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. It was a picturesque, peaceful suburb located about an hour outside of Chicago. The streets were lined with tall oak trees that turned brilliant shades of gold and red in the autumn. The houses were neat, with perfectly cut grass and wide front porches. Everyone knew their neighbors. People left their doors unlocked during the day. Children rode their bicycles down the sidewalks until the streetlights came on. It was a safe place. It was a predictable place. It was the last place in the world you would ever expect a nightmare to unfold. At the center of this quiet community lived Clara and Richard Vance. They were a couple that seemed to have it all. Richard was 28 years old, a hardworking and successful architect who worked for a firm in the city. He was handsome, polite, and well-liked by everyone on their street. Clara was 25 years old, with soft features, warm brown eyes, and a smile that made people feel instantly comfortable. She was a kindergarten teacher at the local elementary school, known for her endless patience and gentle voice. To the outside world, their life was a picture of suburban perfection. But behind closed doors, Clara and Richard had been carrying a heavy emotional burden. For 4 long years, they had been trying desperately to start a family. They had faced the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages. The losses had taken a toll on them, filling their home with a quiet, lingering sadness. But in the spring of 1994, everything changed. Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy held strong. The weeks turned into months, and the doctor assured them that both Clara and the baby were perfectly healthy. They were expecting a little girl. By November of 1994, Clara was 8 months pregnant. She was radiant. The sadness that had once shadowed her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a deep, glowing joy. She had taken an early leave from her teaching job to prepare for the baby's arrival. She spent her days nesting, decorating the nursery, and knitting small blankets. The nursery was her pride and joy. Richard had painted the walls a soft, cheerful yellow. In the corner sat a beautifully carved wooden crib, filled with soft white blankets and a small stuffed bear. Clara would often sit in the white rocking chair by the window for hours, resting her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and dreaming about the future. Everything was finally falling into place. Their long-awaited miracle was almost here. The day of the disappearance. Tuesday, November 14, 1994, started like any other ordinary day in Oak Creek. The weather had turned bitterly cold overnight. A heavy layer of gray clouds hung low in the sky, and the local news stations were predicting the first major snowstorm of the season. At 7:00 in the morning, Richard kissed his wife goodbye. He had a 2-day corporate retreat in downtown Chicago, a mandatory event for the partners at his architecture firm. Clara walked him to the front door, wearing her thick woolen bathrobe, holding a warm cup of herbal tea. She smiled, told him to drive safely in the coming snow, and watched from the porch as his car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. The morning passed quietly. Clara had a simple routine. At 9:00 a.m., she walked down to the end of the driveway to collect the morning newspaper. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, was walking her dog and waved to Clara across the street. Mrs. Gable later told police that Clara looked happy, relaxed, and entirely normal. They exchanged a few words about the freezing temperature, and Clara hurried back inside the warm house. At noon, the snow began to fall. It started as light flurries but quickly turned into a heavy, blinding snowfall. The wind howled through the oak trees, rattling the windows of the houses. The streets of Oak Creek quickly became empty as everyone stayed indoors, staying warm by their fireplaces. At exactly 15 p.m., Clara picked up the kitchen telephone and dialed her mother, Helen. Helen lived in a neighboring town about 45 minutes away. Clara and her mother were incredibly close, and they spoke on the phone almost every single day. The conversation was entirely normal. It was mundane, everyday talk. Clara told her mother that she was making a pot of homemade chicken soup for dinner. She talked about the snowstorm outside and how glad she was to be safe inside the warm house. They discussed baby names again, debating whether the baby should be named Lily or Charlotte. She was so happy, Helen would later say, her voice breaking with tears. She was just my sweet Clara. There was absolutely nothing wrong. Nothing was out of the ordinary. It was just a normal Tuesday afternoon. But then at approximately 3:42 p.m., the normal afternoon came to a sudden halt. While Helen was mid-sentence, talking about a baby blanket she was sewing, Clara suddenly interrupted her. "Hold on, Mom," Clara said. Her voice wasn't scared, it wasn't panicked. It was just slightly curious. "Someone is knocking at the front door." Helen paused. "Who is it in this weather?" she asked. "I don't know," Clara replied. "Let me go check. Hold on just a second, don't hang up." Helen heard the sound of the phone receiver being placed down on the kitchen counter. She heard Clara's footsteps walking away from the kitchen, moving toward the front hallway. She heard the faint squeak of the front door hinges as it opened. And then nothing. Helen waited on the line. 1 minute passed, then 2 minutes. Helen called out her daughter's name. "Clara, are you there? Who was at the door?" There was no response. The only sound coming through the telephone was the faint, distant hum of the open line. 5 minutes passed. Helen started to feel a small knot of worry in her stomach. She told herself that Clara was probably just talking to a delivery driver or a neighbor who needed help shoveling their driveway. She told herself there was a logical explanation. But as 10 minutes passed, the knot in her stomach tightened into genuine fear. "Clara, pick up the phone," Helen shouted into the receiver. Silence. After 15 minutes of waiting and listening to dead air, the line suddenly disconnected with a sharp click. Someone, or something, had hung up the phone. The panic sets in. Helen immediately dialed Clara's number again. It rang and rang, echoing endlessly. Nobody picked up. The answering machine didn't even click on. Panic completely took over. Helen knew her daughter. Clara was 8 months pregnant. She couldn't stand on her feet for long periods. She wouldn't just leave her mother waiting on the phone for 15 minutes without coming back to say goodbye. Something felt wrong, really wrong. Helen immediately called Richard's office in Chicago. The receptionist politely informed her that Richard was currently in a closed-door seminar and could not be disturbed. Helen demanded that they pull him out of the meeting, but the receptionist refused. Desperate, Helen flipped through her personal phone book and found the number for Clara's next-door neighbor, Martha Evans. Helen dialed the number with shaking hands. Martha picked up on the second ring. "Martha, it's Helen, Clara's mother," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just on the phone with Clara. She went to answer the front door and she never came back. The phone hung up. Can you please go over there and check on her? I'm so worried." Martha looked out her living room window. The snow was falling in heavy sheets now, coating the neighborhood in a thick white blanket. "Of course, Helen," Martha said. "I'll go right now. I'll call you right back." Martha put on her heavy winter coat and her snow boots. She stepped out into the freezing wind and carefully made her way across the snow-covered lawns toward Clara's house. The wind was so loud it masked the sound of her own footsteps. As Martha approached the Vance residence, she noticed something that made her freeze in her tracks. The front door was open. It wasn't just unlocked. It was wide open, swinging slightly in the freezing wind. The bitter cold air and the driving snow were blowing directly into Clara's warm hallway. Martha's heart began to pound against her ribs. She hurried up the driveway. She climbed the front porch steps, calling out Clara's name. "Clara, are you in there? "It's Martha." There was no answer. Martha stepped cautiously into the house. The hallway was freezing. A small pile of snow had already accumulated on the hardwood floor just inside the doorway. "Clara," Martha yelled, stepping further into the house. The silence inside was thick and heavy. Martha walked into the kitchen. The scene she found there made her blood run cold. The telephone receiver was dangling off the counter, swinging back and forth on its long, curly cord. On the stove, a pot of chicken soup was bubbling violently, boiling over the sides and sizzling against the hot metal burner. Martha quickly turned off the stove. She ran through the house, checking the living room, the bathrooms, the master bedroom, and the yellow nursery. The house was completely empty. Clara was gone. Trembling, Martha ran back to the kitchen and picked up the dangling phone. She dialed 911. The police arrive. Within 10 minutes, the wail of police sirens cut through the howling wind of the snowstorm. 2 squad cars skidded to a halt in front of the Vance house. Officer Miller, a veteran of the local police force, was the first one through the door. He found Martha standing in the kitchen, hugging herself and crying. She explained exactly what had happened. She explained the phone call from Helen, the open front door, the boiling stove. Officer Miller and his partner immediately secured the house. They performed a thorough sweep of every room, every closet, and the basement. There was no one inside. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing was broken. No furniture was overturned. The house was perfectly neat and perfectly clean. But as Officer Miller began to process the scene, he noticed a series of chilling details that defied all logic. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. First, he looked at the front entryway. Clara's heavy winter coat was still hanging on the hook by the door. Her thick wool scarf and gloves were tucked neatly into the pockets. Second, he looked at the floor beneath the coat rack. Clara's winter snow boots were sitting exactly where they always belonged. In fact, all of her shoes were accounted for in the house. Third, sitting on the kitchen counter, just inches away from where the phone had been dangling, was Clara's purse. Officer Miller opened it. Inside, he found her wallet, her driver's license, her credit cards, and her house keys. A heavy, suffocating sense of dread settled over the police officers. Clara Vance was 25 years old and 8 months pregnant. Outside, a massive winter blizzard was dropping temperatures below freezing. She did not pack a bag. She did not take her keys. She did not take her money. She did not take her winter coat. She did not even put on her shoes. She had answered a knock at her front door on a normal Tuesday afternoon, holding the phone in one hand. And then, she had simply vanished into thin air, walking out into a freezing blizzard entirely barefoot. Or, as Officer Miller realized with a sickening drop in his stomach, she didn't walk out at all. Someone took her. But as Officer Miller walked back out onto the front porch and looked down at the fresh, undisturbed snow covering the front walkway, he realized the most impossible part of the entire mystery, the detail that would haunt the town of Oak Creek for the next 2 decades. There were no footprints leading away from the house. How does a heavily pregnant woman vanish from her own home, without a coat, without shoes, without her keys, leaving an open door and a boiling stove, without leaving a single footprint in the snow? Who was at the door? And what happened to the baby? The freezing wind howled through the streets of Oak Creek, blowing thick sheets of snow horizontally across the yards. Officer Miller stood on the front porch of the Vance residence, staring down at the pristine, untouched snow covering the walkway. A heavy, suffocating dread settled deep in his chest. In any missing person case, the first 48 hours are critical. But when the missing person is a 25-year-old woman who is 8 months pregnant, and the temperature outside is dropping below zero, the clock moves 10 times faster. Clara Vance had no winter coat. She had no boots. She had left her purse, her money, and her keys sitting on the kitchen counter. If she was out in this blizzard, she would not survive the night. Officer Miller immediately called for backup. Within 30 minutes, the quiet suburban street was completely blocked off by police cruisers, their red and blue lights flashing against the falling snow. Search and rescue teams were dispatched. K-9 units were brought to the house to try and track Clara's scent. A police dog handler brought a German shepherd to the front door, letting the dog smell one of Clara's unwashed sweaters. The dog aggressively sniffed the floorboards in the hallway, moved out onto the front porch, and then stopped. The dog paced in small circles on the edge of the porch stairs, whining softly. It couldn't find a trail. The howling wind and the rapidly accumulating snow were wiping away any trace of a scent faster than the dogs could track it. Or, as the handler grimly suggested to Officer Miller, there was no trail to follow because Clara never set foot on the ground. She was taken directly from the doorway. While the search began in Oak Creek, 2 Chicago police officers arrived at the downtown hotel where Richard Vance was attending his corporate retreat. They walked into a large, glass-walled conference room in the middle of a presentation. The room went silent as the officers approached Richard. When they pulled him into the hallway and told him that his pregnant wife was missing, Richard's reaction was captured by several of his coworkers. He didn't just look surprised. He completely fell apart. The coffee mug in his hand slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. He was in such a state of severe shock and panic that the officers had to physically help him walk to the police cruiser. He was entirely incapable of driving himself home. Richard was rushed back to the Oak Creek police station. Despite his visible devastation, investigators had to follow standard procedure. In almost every case where a pregnant woman goes missing, the husband is the first and most statistically likely suspect. The police placed Richard in a small interview room and began to question him aggressively. They needed to know if the marriage was failing, if they had argued that morning, or if there were any life insurance policies recently opened in Clara's name. But Richard had absolutely nothing to hide, and his alibi was virtually unbreakable. Detectives confirmed that Richard had arrived at the Chicago hotel at 9:00 a.m. He had signed in at the front desk. Over 15 different corporate executives testified that Richard had been sitting in the same conference room from 1:00 p.m. straight through to 5:00 p.m. Hotel security cameras captured him walking the hallways during his short breaks. There was a 45-minute drive between Chicago and Oak Creek, and the blizzard had turned the highways into a parking lot of stalled traffic. It was physically impossible for Richard Vance to have left the hotel, driven home, harmed his wife, and returned to the meeting without anyone noticing. He was completely, unequivocally cleared of any involvement. By Thursday morning, the brutal snowstorm finally broke. The gray clouds parted and pale winter sunlight washed over the town. The community of Oak Creek mobilized immediately. Hundreds of local volunteers, wearing heavy parkas and thick gloves, formed search lines. They walked shoulder to shoulder through the local parks, the dense patches of woods, and along the frozen banks of the nearby river. They used long wooden poles to poke into deep snowdrifts. Clara's mother, Helen, appeared on the local evening news. She looked exhausted, her face pale and her eyes swollen from days of crying. She held up a photograph of Clara smiling at her baby shower. "Please," Helen begged into the camera, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "If someone has my daughter, please just let her go. She is going to have a baby any day now. She needs to be in a hospital. She hasn't done anything to anyone. Please just bring my little girl home." Her pleas echoed in living rooms across the state, but they were met with absolute silence. No ransom notes were ever delivered. No phone calls demanding money were ever made. No anonymous tips led to any dark basements or abandoned cabins. Clara had simply ceased to exist. A breakthrough in the crime scene finally happened 3 days later, when the temperature rose just enough for the thick snow on the Vance property to begin melting. Crime scene technicians were doing a secondary sweep of the front yard when they noticed something hidden beneath the receding snowbanks. Deep, heavy indentations were carved into the soft, muddy grass of the front lawn. They were tire tracks. Investigators carefully measured and photographed the treads. The tracks did not belong in the driveway. Someone had driven a heavy vehicle, likely a large van or a heavy-duty truck, off the paved street, straight across the front grass, and had aggressively reversed the vehicle all the way up to the house. The rear tires had stopped less than 2 feet away from the bottom of the front porch stairs. This discovery finally explained the missing footprints. The person at the door didn't force Clara to walk down the driveway in the snow. When Clara opened the front door with the phone in her hand, the vehicle was already parked directly against the steps. She was pulled out of the warm house and thrown straight into the back of the vehicle in a matter of seconds. The speed of the abduction explained why the house was undisturbed and why the phone was left dangling from the counter. It was a highly calculated, targeted strike. Someone knew she was home alone. Someone knew the blizzard would cover their tracks. But who? Days slowly turned into weeks. November bled into December. Christmas lights were hung on the houses in Oak Creek, but the town felt completely hollow. The joy of the season was entirely overshadowed by the heavy, lingering absence of the young teacher. Inside the Vance house, the silence was deafening. The beautiful yellow nursery with the wooden crib sat empty, gathering dust. The small white blankets remained neatly folded. Richard couldn't bear to live in the house anymore. The memory of Clara was everywhere, in the smell of her perfume lingering in the bathroom, in her handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator. After a month, Richard packed a single suitcase and moved into his parents' house 2 towns over. He was a shell of a man, haunted by a ghost. As the new year arrived, the Oak Creek Police Department realized the case was going cold. They had chased down every tip. They had interviewed every neighbor, every coworker, and every parent of the children Clara taught at the elementary school. There were no enemies. There were no jealous ex-boyfriends. There were no disgruntled neighbors. Desperate for a new angle, the lead detective on the case, Detective Miller, decided to completely tear apart Clara's life from the inside out. If the abduction was targeted, the attacker had to know her routine. Miller requested subpoenas for all of Clara's medical records, financial statements, and every single phone call made to or from the Vance house in the 6 months leading up to her disappearance. The investigation started with the phone records from the day she vanished. They looked at the timeline. Helen had called the house at exactly 3:15 p.m. But as Detective Miller ran a finger down the printed phone logs, he stopped. Something didn't make sense. Just 3 minutes before Helen's call, at exactly 3:12 p.m., an incoming call had been answered by Clara. The call had lasted for only 18 seconds. The police quickly traced the origin of that 3:12 p.m. phone call. It didn't come from a telemarketer or a long-distance relative. It came from a public payphone located outside a local gas station, just 4 blocks away from the Vance house. Someone had been standing in the freezing snow just a few streets over and called Clara's house to make sure she was home. 18 seconds later, they hung up, drove the heavy vehicle down the street, parked on her lawn, and knocked on her door. Detectives immediately drove to the gas station. They interviewed the young man who had been working the cash register on the afternoon of the blizzard. They asked if he remembered anyone using the outdoor payphone in the middle of the heavy snowfall. The cashier nodded slowly. He did remember. He told the detectives that he had been looking out the window, wondering who would be crazy enough to stand outside in a freezing blizzard to use a payphone. "Did you get a look at the guy?" Detective Miller asked, holding his pen ready. "It wasn't a guy," the cashier replied. "It was a woman. She was wearing a heavy dark coat with a hood pulled up. She was only on the phone for a few seconds. Then she got into a dark blue car and drove off toward the residential neighborhood." A woman. The detectives were stunned. Statistically, Violent abductions of pregnant women were incredibly rare, but when they did happen, the profiles often pointed toward a very specific type of offender. Was Clara targeted by someone who wanted her baby? To understand Clara's pregnancy better, Detective Miller drove to the nearby medical clinic to interview Clara's longtime obstetrician, Dr. Aris. The detectives wanted to know if Clara had interacted with any strange patients in the waiting room, or if anyone had asked unusual questions about her due date. Dr. Aris was an older, soft-spoken man who had delivered hundreds of bobbies in the area. When Detective Miller sat down in his office and asked about Clara Vance's 8-month pregnancy, the doctor looked at him with a deep, furrowed brow of total confusion. "I don't understand," Dr. Aris said, adjusting his glasses. "Why are the news stations and the police saying she was 8 months pregnant?" Detective Miller frowned. Because she was, doctor, her husband and her mother confirmed it. She was due in less than a month. Dr. Aris slowly shook his head. He pulled out a thick manila folder from his filing cabinet and slid it across the desk toward the detective. "Clara Vance has been a patient of mine for years," Dr. Aris said softly, "but I haven't seen her since early September. She called my receptionist and abruptly canceled all her remaining prenatal appointments. She said she was transferring her care to another doctor, but she refused to tell us who it was." Detective Miller stared at the file. "She changed doctors. Her husband didn't know that. Richard told us he personally dropped her off at this clinic every 2 weeks for her checkups. He said he dropped her off right at your front door." The doctor looked equally disturbed. "If he was dropping her off here, she never came into my office. We haven't treated her in over 2 months." A cold chill ran down Detective Miller's spine. Clara Vance had been lying to her husband. She had been lying to her mother. Detectives immediately requested the clinic's lobby security tapes from the months of September and October. The clinic kept their old VHS surveillance tapes in a storage closet. It took hours of fast-forwarding through grainy, black and white footage, cross-referencing the dates Richard said he had dropped Clara off. Finally, they found the right timestamp, October 14th, a Tuesday morning. The detectives crowded around the small television screen in the police station. On the tape, they watched Richard's familiar silver car pull up to the front sliding doors of the medical clinic. The passenger door opened, and Clara stepped out. She looked heavy with child, wearing a large maternity sweater. She smiled brightly, waved at Richard through the window, and turned to walk through the automatic glass doors into the lobby. The camera showed Richard's car pulling away from the curb and disappearing down the street. For about 30 seconds, Clara stood perfectly still inside the lobby. She didn't approach the reception desk. She didn't take off her coat. The detectives watched in absolute silence as Clara's bright smile completely faded from her face. Her expression turned serious, almost cold. She looked over her shoulder, checking to make sure her husband's car was truly gone. Then she turned around, walked right back out the automatic sliding doors and stood on the sidewalk. 2 minutes later, an unmarked dark blue sedan pulled up to the exact spot where her husband had just been. Clara didn't hesitate. She opened the passenger door, climbed inside, and the dark blue car drove away. She wasn't going to a doctor's appointment. She was going somewhere else, and someone else was taking her. Clara Vance wasn't just abducted by a random stranger in the snow. She had a secret life. She was hiding something massive from the people who loved her most, and whoever was driving that dark blue car was the key to finding out exactly what she was hiding. Time is the cruelest element in any missing person investigation. It does not stop, it does not pause, and it does not care about the people left behind. In Oak Creek, the seasons changed. The heavy winter snow of 1994 eventually melted into spring. The spring turned into summer, and the years began to stack on top of one another. The missing person posters of Clara Vance, once stapled to every telephone pole and storefront window in town, slowly faded under the summer sun. Eventually, The paper curled, the staples rusted, and the wind tore them away. The beautiful house with the wide front porch was eventually sold. The new owners, a young couple with no knowledge of the tragedy, painted over the soft yellow walls of the nursery. They threw away the wooden crib. They replaced the front door. The physical memory of Clara was slowly erased from the neighborhood. For the families involved, the passage of time was an agonizing, slow-motion nightmare. Richard Vance tried to hold on to hope, but the empty house and the whispering neighbors broke him. 5 years after the blizzard, Richard packed up the remainder of his life and moved across the country to Arizona. He rarely spoke of Oak Creek again. Clara's mother, Helen, never left. She stayed in her small house, paying the phone bill every single month, keeping the same landline number just in case her daughter ever called. She kept Clara's favorite winter coat hanging by the front door, but the waiting took a terrible physical toll. Helen's health failed rapidly. In the winter of 2012, 18 years after her daughter vanished into the snow, Helen passed away in a nursing facility. The nurses said she spent her final days looking out the window at the falling snow, whispering Clara's name. The Oak Creek Police Department officially classified the investigation as a cold case. The boxes of files, the witness statements, and the grainy security tapes were packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into a dusty corner of the evidence room. But one man refused to let it go, Detective Miller. By the time 2018 arrived, 24 years had passed since the day of the blizzard. Detective Miller was now in his late 60s. His hair had turned entirely white, and he had officially retired from the police force a decade earlier. But he had never truly left the Vance case behind. When he retired, he requested photocopies of every single document in the case file. He set up a large corkboard in the basement of his home. Every night, he would sit in the dim light, staring at the grainy photograph of Clara getting into that dark blue sedan. He knew the secret was in that car. He knew the woman driving that vehicle held the answer to the entire mystery, but the trail was entirely dead. There were no license plates visible. There were no new witnesses. It was a ghost car, driven by a ghost, taking Clara into nowhere. Until a cold, rainy morning in November of 2018. At the Oak Creek Police Precinct, a young investigator named Detective Reed was working the morning shift. The precinct was quiet. The phone on his desk rang. The caller ID showed a number from downtown Chicago. Detective Reed answered. On the other end of the line was a medical administrator from Mercy General Hospital, a large, sprawling medical center in the heart of Chicago. The administrator explained that the hospital was undergoing a massive, legally mandated archival project. They were taking tens of thousands of old, decaying paper medical records from the 1980s and 1990s and scanning them into a modern digital database before destroying the physical copies. During this digital transfer, the scanning software automatically ran patient names and social security numbers through a national database to update medical histories. That morning, the software had triggered a high-level red flag. The archivist had scanned a medical file belonging to a patient named Clara Vance. The social security number on the hospital intake form was a perfect, exact match for the famous missing woman from Oak Creek. Detective Reed immediately realized the magnitude of the call. He didn't just walk to his supervisor. He picked up his cell phone and directly called retired Detective Miller. Miller was sitting in his kitchen drinking black coffee when the phone rang. When Reed told him about the hospital record in Chicago, Miller dropped his coffee mug on the floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces, but he didn't even look down. Within 20 minutes, Miller was dressed in his car and speeding toward the Oak Creek precinct. Miller and Reed drove to Chicago together. The drive took over an hour, and neither man spoke for most of the trip. Miller's mind was racing, cycling through 100 different theories. For 24 years, he had believed Clara was abducted to steal her unborn baby. Why would a Chicago hospital have a medical file on her? Clara's doctor was in Oak Creek. She had never mentioned traveling to Chicago for medical care. Was she taken to Mercy General after she was abducted? Did the woman in the blue car take her there to deliver the baby in secret? They arrived at Mercy General and were escorted down into the sub-basement levels of the hospital. The archives room was a massive, windowless concrete vault filled with endless rows of metal filing cabinets. The air smelled strongly of dust and old, degrading paper. The head archivist, a quiet woman with thick glasses, was waiting for them at a metal table under a buzzing fluorescent light. Sitting in the center of the table was a single, thin, yellowed manila folder. "I pulled the original paper file as soon as the system flagged the name," the archivist said softly, sliding the folder across the table toward the detectives. "I saw the missing person alerts in the database. I thought you needed to see this immediately." Miller's hands were actually shaking as he reached out and opened the cover of the folder. The first page was an emergency room intake form. The date at the top of the page made Miller's breath catch in his throat. September 14, 1994. Exactly 2 months before the blizzard. Exactly 2 months before Clara vanished. Miller leaned in, his eyes scanning the faded ink. Clara Vance had been rushed to the emergency room at Mercy General by a highway ambulance. She had been found collapsed in the bathroom of a rest stop just outside the city limits. He looked at the patient's signature line at the bottom of the intake form. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Clara's elegant, looping cursive. It was really her. "Why was she admitted?" Detective Reed asked, leaning over Miller's shoulder. Miller turned the page. The next document was a surgical pathology report. The medical terminology was dense, but the conclusion was stark, brutal, and completely undeniable. Clara Vance had suffered a catastrophic, late-term miscarriage. The internal hemorrhaging had been so severe that the emergency room surgeons had rushed her into the operating room to save her life. The doctor's handwritten notes at the bottom of the page told the rest of the tragic story. The physical damage was extensive. To stop the bleeding and save Clara from dying on the operating table, the surgeons had been forced to perform an emergency hysterectomy. Miller read the final sentence of the doctor's notes out loud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patient informed of the surgical outcome. Patient advised she will no longer be able to conceive or carry a child." The basement room went completely silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded incredibly loud. Miller stared at the yellowed paper in total shock. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. When Clara vanished on November 14th, her husband Richard swore she was 8 months pregnant. He testified that he felt the baby kicking against his hand at night. Her mother Helen had been sewing baby blankets. The neighbors saw her walking down the driveway, heavy and swollen with child. The nursery was painted. The crib was built. The entire community was preparing for a baby girl. But the medical record sitting on the metal table proved that was a physical impossibility. Clara had lost the baby on September 14th, and because of the surgery, she could never get pregnant again. Miller's mind violently snapped back to the timeline of the old investigation. September 14th. That was the exact same week Clara had abruptly called Dr. Aris in Oak Creek and canceled all of her remaining prenatal appointments. She had told her local doctor she was transferring to a new clinic, but she never did. Because there was no baby anymore. For 2 entire months, Clara Vance had lived a massive, calculated lie. She had returned to her beautiful suburban home, looked her husband in the eye, and pretended everything was fine. She had worn a high-quality prosthetic belly under her heavy maternity sweaters. She had faked the kicks. She had faked the joy. She had sat in the yellow nursery, rocking in the chair, pretending to be a mother. "My God," Detective Reed whispered, running a hand over his face. "She wasn't pregnant when she disappeared. The whole town was looking for a pregnant woman. The news stations, the dogs, the volunteers. We were all looking for something that didn't exist." If Clara wasn't pregnant, then the entire foundation of the police investigation for the last 24 years was built on a lie. She wasn't targeted by a baby thief. She wasn't abducted because she was vulnerable. But if she wasn't pregnant, why did she get into that dark blue sedan a month later? Miller's heart began to pound violently in his chest. A terrifying, sickening realization began to wash over him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his leather notebook. Folded inside the notebook was the grainy, black and white photocopy of the CCTV image from the medical clinic. The photograph from October 14th, showing Clara getting into the passenger side of the dark blue car. For 24 years, Miller had looked at this photograph and assumed the woman driving the blue car was a baby broker, or a kidnapper, or an accomplice. He had assumed the driver was the predator, and Clara was the victim. Miller placed the photograph flat on the metal table. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pocket and hovered it over the grainy image of the driver behind the steering wheel. He had looked at this image 1,000 times, but he had always looked at it through the lens of Clara being the pregnant victim. Now, looking at it with the truth exposed, Miller saw the detail he had completely missed for 2 decades. The woman driving the blue car was leaning awkwardly to the side. The steering wheel was pressed incredibly tight against her body. The driver of the blue car was heavily pregnant. The silence in the concrete archives room was deafening. The truth hit Detective Miller like a physical blow to the chest. Clara Vance wasn't the victim of a baby thief. Clara Vance was hunting for a baby of her own. Desperate, grieving, and entirely broken by her medical trauma, Clara had found a pregnant woman, a vulnerable woman in a dark blue car. Clara was planning to buy her baby illegally, or worse, she was planning to steal it, to pass the child off to her husband as their own. Clara wasn't the prey, Clara was the predator. But if Clara was the one orchestrating the plot, why did the blue car suddenly back up to her front porch in the middle of a blinding blizzard? And why did Clara vanish without her coat, without her shoes, and without a trace? Something had gone terribly wrong on the afternoon of November 14th. The predator had become the victim. The rain poured heavily against the windshield of the unmarked police cruiser, the wipers slashing back and forth with a rhythmic, hypnotic click. Stripped of the illusion that had framed the case for over 2 decades, retired Detective Miller and Detective Reed sat in the front seat, staring out at the gray Chicago streets. The revelation from the hospital archives had shattered everything they thought they knew. Clara Vance was never pregnant when she vanished. The nursery, the baby shower, the glowing smiles. It was all a beautifully constructed facade, a desperate lie born from a woman's unhealed trauma and a broken heart. But the new truth was far more dangerous. If Clara was using a fake belly to hide her emergency surgery, and if she was caught on camera getting into a vehicle driven by a heavily pregnant stranger, it meant she was hunting for a child. She had been operating in the dark, desperate to find an infant she could pass off as her own before her husband and mother discovered the truth. But somewhere in that dark underworld of private, illegal baby transactions, the plan had collapsed. The predator had become the target. They knew they had to find the woman in the dark blue sedan. In 1994, the police had looked for a kidnapper, a stranger who had snatched a vulnerable pregnant woman from her home. Now, they had to look for someone Clara had targeted. Reed drove aggressively back to the Oak Creek precinct, his mind racing with the legal and procedural hurdles ahead. They needed to dig into the past using modern technology that didn't exist when the case first went cold. Back at the station, Reed cleared off a massive desk and brought up the state's historical vehicle registration database. In 1994, records were kept on magnetic tapes and primitive digital systems, but over the years, the state had digitized everything. Reed filtered the search parameters with precise accuracy. He looked for any dark blue, 4-door sedans registered between 1990 and 1994 in the Tri-County area surrounding Oak Creek. He restricted the primary owner profile to females born between 1970 and 1975, matching the approximate age of the pregnant driver seen in the grainy surveillance footage. The system groaned as it processed thousands of historical files. For 3 hours, Miller and Reed sat in front of the flickering monitor, their eyes straining against the columns of data. The initial search returned over 400 matches. It was too broad. Miller leaned forward, tapping his weathered finger against the glass. Cross-reference those names with County Health Department records from the autumn of 1994, he instructed, his voice low and intense. Look for any female on that vehicle list who applied for state prenatal care, or who was flagged as an unwed expectant mother in the social services database during those exact months. If Clara was hunting for a baby, she wouldn't target a wealthy family with private doctors. She would look for someone vulnerable, someone desperate for money, someone who felt like they had no other choice. Reed's fingers flew across the keyboard, linking the DMV records with the historical archives of the Department of Human Services. The list of 400 names instantly shrank. Dozens of names disappeared from the screen, leaving only a handful of results. Finally, the computer chimed, displaying a single file at the top of the monitor. The vehicle was a 1989 dark blue Chevy Celebrity. The registered owner in November of 1994 was a 20-year-old woman named Evelyn Mercer. Her registered address was in Elgin, Illinois, a blue-collar industrial town located about 30 miles north of Oak Creek. Miller pulled Evelyn Mercer's historical background file up on the screen. The details matched the psychological profile perfectly. In the summer of 1994, Evelyn was completely broke. She had dropped out of high school, was unmarried, and had been cut off by her family. Social services records showed she had visited a public clinic in August of 1994, confirming she was 5 months pregnant with a due date in late November. She was completely alone, living in a rundown rented trailer. But it was the next line in the family background check that made Miller's blood run cold. Evelyn Mercer didn't live entirely alone. In October of 1994, due to her inability to pay rent, her older brother had moved into the trailer with her to help cover expenses. His name was Ray Mercer. He was 26 years old at the time, working as an independent drywall contractor and heavy machinery operator. According to old state records, Ray Mercer's primary work vehicle was a 1992 heavy-duty GMC Sierra pickup truck with dual rear tires. Miller felt a familiar, electric jolt of adrenaline, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he wore the badge full-time. The tire tracks in the mud outside Clara's house. The deep, wide indentations that had been hidden beneath the snowbanks for 3 days until the winter weather broke. They weren't from a commercial delivery van. They were the exact match for a heavy-duty, dual-wheel contractor's truck. The blue sedan at the medical clinic belonged to the pregnant sister, but the heavy truck that backed up to Clara's front porch during the blizzard belonged to the brother. "We have the connection," Reed whispered, staring at the brother's photograph on the screen. Ray Mercer had a rough, weathered face, dark eyes, and a history of minor arrests for bar fights and petty theft. The sister drives the car to meet Clara at the clinic in October to negotiate the deal. But on the day of the disappearance, in the middle of a historic blizzard, they don't take the sedan. The car would get stuck in the snow drifts. They take Ray's heavy-duty 4-wheel drive truck to get to Oak Creek. Miller didn't waste a second. "Look into their finances," he demanded. "Look at what happened to Ray and Evelyn Mercer immediately after November 14, 1994. Reed accessed the state's financial intelligence archives, tracking old bank accounts linked to the Mercer names. Because of the age of the records, they had to wait for microfilm scans to generate from the central repository. When the documents finally flashed onto the screen, the hidden financial connection became clear. On November 20, 1994, exactly 6 days after Clara Vance vanished into thin air, Ray Mercer walked into a local bank in Elgin. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag. He deposited $15,000 in cold, hard cash into his savings account. The very next day, he used that exact cash to completely pay off the remaining debt on his GMC truck and clear his back rent. Miller remembered a detail from the original investigation that had always bothered him. In October of 1994, Clara Vance had walked into her local bank in Oak Creek and withdrawn $20,000 from her and Richard's joint savings account. When Richard later found the missing money during the initial investigation, he told police that Clara had explained it away. She told him she was using the cash to pay for a high-end private midwife service, a premium birthing coach, and imported wooden furniture for the yellow nursery. Richard, trusting his wife completely and desperate to keep her stress levels low after her previous miscarriages, never questioned her. He never called the midwife. He never checked the receipts. In reality, Clara had withdrawn the family savings to buy Evelyn Mercer's unborn child. She was paying for a baby. But something had gone terribly, violently wrong with the transaction. If the deal was a simple cash-for-baby exchange, it should have happened in late November at a hospital or a secluded motel after Evelyn gave birth. Why did Ray Mercer drive his heavy truck to Clara's house in the middle of a life-threatening blizzard on November 14th? Why did Clara open the door, leave her purse, her coat, and her shoes behind, and disappear forever? If they just wanted the money, they already had the cash, or at least they knew where it was. "Where are they now?" Miller asked, his eyes locked on the old files. "Where is Evelyn? Where is Ray?" Reed tapped the keys, running the Social Security numbers through the National Death Index and current address registries. A tragic, frustrating update appeared on the screen. Evelyn Mercer was dead. She had passed away in 2002 at the age of 28 from a sudden medical event related to liver failure. The sister, the pregnant woman from the blue car, could no longer speak to them. She had taken her secrets to a cemetery in northern Illinois 16 years ago. But her brother, Ray Mercer, was still alive. According to current tax records and driver's license renewals, Ray was now 71 years old. He had left the Chicago area decades ago, moving down to a deeply rural, isolated area of southern Illinois, just outside a tiny town called Effingham. He lived alone in a small cabin on a gravel road, far away from any major cities. "Get the car keys," Miller said, pushing himself up from the desk. His old joints popped, but his posture was completely straight. "We're driving to Effingham." The journey down into southern Illinois took over 3 hours. As the highway stretched south, the suburban sprawl of Chicago melted away, replaced by endless, flat cornfields that had been harvested for the winter. The cold November rain turned into a thick, low-hanging fog that drifted across the empty landscape. The atmosphere felt eerie, almost identical to the heavy, claustrophobic weather of late 1994. Neither Miller nor Reed spoke. The weight of 24 years of silence hung over them. Miller thought about Richard Vance, living out his life in Arizona, his soul permanently scarred by the belief that his beautiful pregnant wife had been stolen by a monster. He thought about Helen, dying in that nursing home, watching the snow fall and praying for a daughter who was actually living a dark, desperate double life. The tragedy was expanding, mutating into something far uglier than a random act of violence. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when the cruiser turned off the paved highway onto a narrow, rutted gravel road lined with skeletal gray trees. They drove for 2 miles into the dense woods until they reached a small, weathered log cabin sitting in a clearing. The paint was peeling, and the roof was covered in green moss. In the tall grass beside the porch sat the rusted, decaying frame of an old truck. It was a 1992 GMC Sierra. The dual rear wheels were sunk deep into the mud, the tires completely flat and rotted away. It was the vehicle from the lawn. Miller and Reed stepped out of the car. The air was freezing, smelling of wet earth and wood smoke. They walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch. Reed placed his hand tightly on his service weapon, his posture tense. Miller stepped forward and knocked heavily on the thick wooden door. For a long minute there was no sound from inside. Then the faint, heavy drag of footsteps echoed across the floorboards. The door opened with a sharp groan. An old man stood in the doorway. Ray Mercer had aged harshly. His face was deeply lined, covered in a thick, unkempt white beard. He wore a stained flannel shirt and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. His dark eyes looked tired, clouded with age. But as his gaze shifted from Detective Reed's modern tactical jacket to the fierce, unmistakable intensity in retired Detective Miller's eyes, something shifted in his expression. A look of ancient, paralyzing terror washed over the old man's face. He knew exactly why they were standing on his porch. "Ray Mercer?" Reed asked, pulling out his badge. "We're with the police. We need to talk to you about November of 1994. We need to talk about Clara Vance." Ray's lips trembled. He looked past the detectives at the empty gravel road, as if he had been waiting for this specific car to pull up his driveway for 24 years. He let out a long, ragged sigh, his shoulders slumping completely. "I wondered when the day would come," Ray whispered, his voice dry and raspy. "I knew it would eventually. You can't keep something like that buried forever. The dirt always shifts." He turned around, leaving the door wide open, and walked back into the dim, cluttered living room of the cabin. The room was cold, heated only by a small wood stove in the corner. Stacks of old newspapers and rusted tools littered the floor. Ray sat down heavily in a worn leather recliner, his hands shaking violently as he reached for a pack of generic cigarettes on the side table. He lit one, inhaling deeply, his eyes staring at the floorboards. Miller and Reed stepped inside, closing the door behind them. Miller didn't sit down. He stood directly over the old man, pulling out the photocopies of the 1994 evidence file. He laid them out one by one on a cluttered wooden coffee table. The tire tracks, the bank deposit slips, the grainy clinic photo of Evelyn in the blue sedan, and finally, the medical report from Mercy General Hospital proving Clara Vance had a hysterectomy in September of 1994. "We know the whole thing, Ray," Miller said, his voice dropping into a hard, demanding tone. "We know Clara Vance wasn't pregnant. We know she was buying your sister's baby. We know she paid you $15,000 in cash. And we know your truck was parked on her front lawn in the middle of the blizzard the day she disappeared. I've spent 24 years looking for her body. Tell us what you did to her." Ray covered his face with his calloused, trembling hands. A low, ragged sob tore from his chest. "We didn't kill her," he wept, his voice cracking. "I swear to you on my sister's grave, we didn't hurt that woman. We never meant for any of it to happen. It was supposed to be a simple handoff. We were just supposed to take the rest of the money and give her the child when it was born." "Then why did you back your truck up to her porch in the middle of a killer blizzard?" Miller barked, leaning in closer. "Why did she leave her house barefoot, without a coat, and never return? If you didn't kill her, where is she?" Ray lowered his hands, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with a deep, haunting horror. "Because the deal changed," he whispered. "Clara went crazy. The grief broke her mind. A week before the blizzard, Clara found out that my sister Evelyn was having second thoughts. Evelyn was starting to love the baby inside her. She wanted to keep it. She tried to call the deal off. She tried to give Clara the deposit money back." Ray took another frantic drag of his cigarette, his chest heaving. "But Clara wouldn't take the money. She told Evelyn that the baby was already hers. She had built the nursery. She had told her husband. She said she would rather die than let anyone find out she had lied. On the afternoon of the storm, Clara called our trailer from a payphone. She was hysterical. She told Evelyn that if we didn't bring the baby right then, she was going to kill herself and blame it on us. She was completely unhinged." "So you drove out there in the blizzard," Reed said, his mind mapping the fatal sequence of events. "Yes," Ray shook his head, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "The snow was blinding. The roads were freezing over. Evelyn was terrified that Clara would hurt herself. We took my big truck because the car couldn't handle the drifts. When we pulled onto her lawn, Evelyn went to the payphone at the corner to call her one last time, to tell her we were outside. When Clara opened the front door, she didn't care about the storm. She didn't care that she didn't have shoes on. She ran out to the truck, screaming, demanding to see the baby. She forced her way into the cab. Ray stopped, his voice catching in his throat, a look of profound dread freezing his features. "What happened in the truck, Ray?" Miller demanded, the suspense in the room rising to a suffocating break point. "What happened next?" Ray looked up at Miller, his face completely pale. "I can't tell you the rest. You won't believe me, but I kept the proof. I kept it because I knew the police would come for me one day, and I needed to show you that I didn't murder her. I couldn't live with the world thinking I was a monster." Ray reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted brass key. He pointed his shaking cane toward a heavy, padlocked wooden door at the back of the cabin. "In that room, in the corner under the floorboards, there is a green metal contractor's toolbox. Everything she had on her is in that box. The clothes, the fake belly, and the recorder. Go look for yourselves." Miller grabbed the key from Ray's hand. He and Reed walked swiftly to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped into a small, cold storage room filled with dust and shadow. In the corner, just as Ray had said, a loose section of the floorboards had been pulled back. Miller reached down into the dark opening and pulled up a heavy, rusted green metal toolbox. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the physical epicenter of a 24-year-old mystery. With shaking fingers, Miller popped the heavy metal latches of the box and threw the lid open. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed plastic dry-cleaning bag, was the thick woolen bathrobe Clara Vance had been wearing on the afternoon of November 14, 1994. It was stained with old, dried mud and dark, ancient fluids. Beneath the robe lay a large, flesh-colored silicone prosthetic belly, its straps torn and sliced open. But it was the item sitting at the very bottom of the toolbox that made Detective Miller freeze in absolute shock. It was a small, black, handheld microcassette voice recorder, the kind professionals used in the 1990s to dictate notes. Attached to the recorder was a small piece of masking tape with Clara's elegant, neat handwriting. It read, "The agreement." Miller lifted the recorder out of the box. The plastic was cold against his palm. The tiny magnetic tape inside was still loaded, wound tightly around the small plastic sprockets. Reed quickly produced 2 fresh AA batteries from his tactical vest and handed them to Miller. Miller slid the battery cover open, snapped the batteries into place, and closed the compartment. They walked back into the living room, where Ray Mercer sat silently in his chair, head bowed, weeping. Miller held the recorder up. His thumb hovered over the heavy, mechanical play button. He looked at Reed, then down at the device. The truth of what happened in the front yard of that Oak Creek house, the final answer to how a pregnant woman vanished into a blizzard without a trace, was trapped on this tiny strip of magnetic tape. Miller pressed the play button down with a loud, metallic click. The small speaker hissed with a loud, aggressive layer of static. The sound of a howling winter wind came through the tape, muffled but powerful. Then the sound of car doors slamming, heavy breathing, shouting. And then Clara Vance's voice cut through the static. It wasn't the gentle, sweet voice of the kindergarten teacher the town remembered. It was sharp, wild, and completely distorted by raw panic and fury. "You don't understand," Clara screamed on the recording, her voice echoing inside the cab of the truck. "It's too late to back out. Richard knows. He found the letters. He knows what I did." Another voice entered the recording, Evelyn Mercer, crying, her voice terrified. "Clara, stop. Get away from me. Let go of my stomach. You're hurting me." "I paid for her," Clara shrieked, a sound of pure madness tearing through the speaker. "She belongs to me. If you don't give her to me right now, I'll tell him the truth about whose baby this really is. I'll tell him what we did in Chicago." Suddenly, on the tape, a violent struggle erupted, the sound of glass shattering. A woman's piercing scream cut through the wind, and then a heavy, sickening thud echoed through the speaker, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The tape continued to hiss with static, the howling wind filling the empty air of the cabin. Miller and Reed stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats, paralyzed by the horrific realization of what they were listening to. The truth was turning upside down once again, and the final puzzle piece was about to fall into place. The sharp click of the recorder button echoing through the small cabin felt like a gunshot. Detective Miller's thumb released the heavy mechanical key, stopping the tape. The harsh, aggressive hiss of static vanished, leaving only the sound of the freezing rain beating against the metal roof of the cabin. Miller and Reed stood entirely paralyzed in the center of the dusty room. The words they had just heard on the old magnetic tape were still ringing in their ears. They had come to southern Illinois expecting to find a violent kidnapper who had stolen a pregnant woman. Instead, they had just listened to the final, terrifying moments of Clara Vance's life, captured 24 years ago. And Clara was not the victim. Clara was the aggressor. Miller slowly lowered the heavy black recorder. He looked at Ray Mercer, who was still sitting in the leather recliner, weeping into his calloused hands. "What did she mean, Ray?" Miller asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and profound disbelief. On the tape, Clara said she was going to tell her husband the truth about whose baby Evelyn was carrying. She said, "I'll tell him what we did in Chicago." Whose baby was it? Ray slowly wiped the tears from his eyes. He looked up, his face hollow, completely defeated by the weight of a secret he had carried for over 2 decades. "It wasn't a random baby," Ray whispered, his voice cracking in the cold air. "Evelyn didn't just meet Clara by accident. Evelyn used to work as a cocktail waitress at a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago, the same hotel where Richard Vance's architecture firm held all of their corporate retreats." The pieces of the puzzle began to violently crash together in Miller's mind. Richard's business trips, the long weekends in the city, the undeniable proximity. "In February of 1994, Ray continued, staring blankly at the floorboards, "Richard Vance had a brief affair with my sister. It was just a handful of nights. But Evelyn got pregnant. She didn't know what to do. She was broke. She was scared. So in April she found Richard's home address in Oak Creek. She wrote him a letter telling him about the baby, and she drove to his house to leave it in his mailbox." Ray took a ragged, shaking breath. But Richard didn't find the letter. Clara did. The horrific reality of the situation washed over the detectives. Clara Vance, a woman who had suffered through multiple miscarriages and was desperately trying to build a family, had walked out to her mailbox and discovered that her husband had a pregnant mistress in Chicago. "Clara confronted my sister in secret," Ray explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She drove to Elgin and found Evelyn. She offered Evelyn a massive amount of cash to keep her mouth shut, to never contact Richard again, and to disappear. Evelyn agreed. But then, a few weeks later, Clara found out she was pregnant herself. A real pregnancy. It felt like a miracle. For the whole summer, Clara thought she was finally going to have her own child, so she left Evelyn alone." Ray pointed a shaking finger at the photocopied hospital record sitting on the coffee table. But then September happened. Clara had that massive medical emergency. She lost her baby. She lost her ability to ever have children. The grief completely shattered her mind. She couldn't face the reality of telling her husband that their baby was dead, especially knowing that his mistress was out there carrying his actual biological child. It was a twisted, deeply psychological nightmare. Clara Vance hadn't just faked her pregnancy to hide her trauma. She had faked it because she had a plan. "In October," Ray said, "Clara came back to my sister. Evelyn was in her 3rd trimester. Clara offered her the rest of their life savings, $20,000 in cash. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Clara would fake the final weeks of her pregnancy. When Evelyn went into labor, Clara would take the baby, pretend she had delivered it at home or at a private clinic, and present the child to Richard as their own." Richard would never know that the baby he was raising was actually his own illegitimate child. But Evelyn changed her mind, Reed said quietly, finally understanding the panic on the tape. Yes, Ray nodded, crying softly. As the due date got closer, Evelyn felt the baby kicking. She became attached. She told Clara she couldn't go through with it. She tried to give the money back. But Clara was too far gone. She had painted the nursery. She had worn the fake belly for 2 months. If the baby didn't arrive, her entire life, her entire marriage would completely collapse. So on the day of the blizzard, Evelyn called Clara from the payphone to beg her to end the deal. Clara threatened to kill herself. She threatened to expose Evelyn to Richard and destroy everyone's lives. "Tell me what happened in the truck, Ray," Miller demanded, stepping closer to the old man. "Tell me exactly how she died." Ray closed his eyes, the memory playing out in his mind like a dark, horrific movie. "We pulled the heavy truck onto her front lawn," Ray whispered. "Evelyn went to the payphone up the street to call her. She told Clara we were outside but that we were just leaving the money on the porch. But Clara didn't wait. She burst through the front door. She didn't even put her shoes on. She ran out into the blinding snow, wearing that heavy robe and the fake stomach. She climbed right into the passenger side of the truck." Ray's hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly. Clara was completely hysterical. Evelyn got back into the truck and Clara just snapped. "She grabbed my sister. She had something heavy in her hand, a glass paperweight or a snow globe from the house. She smashed the passenger window. She started clawing at Evelyn's stomach, screaming that the baby belonged to her. She was trying to hurt my sister. She was going to kill her." Tears streamed down Ray's face, catching in his thick white beard. "I was in the driver's seat. I had to protect Evelyn. I had to protect the unborn baby. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the center console. I just wanted to knock Clara out. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I swung the wrench as hard as I could in the dark in the middle of the blizzard. I hit her in the side of the head." The heavy thud on the tape. "She went completely limp," Ray sobbed. "She died instantly. It was an accident. I swear to God it was an accident. We sat there in the freezing truck, covered in blood, realizing what had just happened. The storm was burying the vehicle. I knew the police would never believe us. They would think we murdered her for the money. So I took her body." "Where is she?" Miller asked, his voice firm but quiet. "Where did you bury her?" "I was a commercial concrete contractor," Ray said, his voice entirely hollow. "The next morning, before the snow even melted, I drove my truck to an industrial park in Elgin. We were laying the foundation for a massive new warehouse. I put Clara in the deepest part of the trench, and I poured 10 tons of solid concrete over her. She's been under the floor of that warehouse for 24 years. The room fell completely silent. The mystery that had consumed the town of Oak Creek, the mystery that had haunted Detective Miller for over 2 decades, was finally completely solved. There was no stranger in the snow. There was no random baby thief. It was a tragedy born from betrayal, grief, and a desperate lie that spiraled completely out of control. Detective Reed stepped forward and quietly read Ray Mercer his rights. The old man didn't fight back. He simply nodded, held out his wrists, and allowed the heavy steel handcuffs to click into place. He looked relieved. The terrible burden he had carried for half his life was finally lifted. The aftermath moved with blinding speed. Within 48 hours, an army of police vehicles and forensic excavation teams descended upon a massive commercial warehouse in Elgin, Illinois. Armed with ground-penetrating radar and heavy jackhammers, they broke through the thick concrete floor in the exact location Ray had described. 7 feet below the surface, encased in dirt and darkness, they found the remains of Clara Vance. When the local news stations broke the story, the entire state went into a state of profound shock. The innocent, beautiful kindergarten teacher they had mourned for 24 years was not the victim of a random monster. She was the architect of a deeply twisted plot to steal a child. But the most devastating moment of the entire resolution fell upon Richard Vance. Detectives flew to Arizona to deliver the news to Richard in person. Now in his 50s, Richard had spent his entire adult life grieving a wife he thought was entirely pure, a woman he believed was violently stolen from him. When the detectives sat him down and explained the truth, that Clara was never pregnant, that she was buying a baby, and that the baby actually belonged to a woman Richard had slept with in a hotel in Chicago, Richard completely collapsed. His one mistake, his one brief moment of infidelity, had set off a chain reaction that destroyed his marriage, ended his wife's life, and trapped him in a 24-year nightmare of unimaginable grief. He wept, not just for the wife he had lost, but for the devastating realization that his own actions had unknowingly triggered the entire tragedy. He had spent decades hunting ghosts, never realizing he was the one who had opened the door and let them in. As for the baby, the final piece of the puzzle brought a strange, quiet sense of peace to the grim story. Evelyn Mercer survived the blizzard. 2 weeks after Clara died, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. She kept the child. She raised her with love, working 3 jobs to make sure her daughter had a good life. Evelyn never told her daughter about her biological father in Oak Creek, and she never told her about the horrific night in the snowstorm. When Evelyn died in 2002, her brother Ray quietly watched over the girl until she reached adulthood. Today, that little girl is a 30-year-old woman. She has a family of her own. She lives a quiet, normal life, completely unaware that before she was even born, a desperate, broken woman had tried to steal her, setting off one of the most famous missing person cases in American history. In the end, the story of Clara Vance is not just a mystery about a disappearance. It is a chilling reminder of the destructive power of secrets. It shows what happens when grief and desperation are left in the dark. A single lie, told to cover a painful truth, can grow into a monster that consumes everyone it touches. The snow eventually melts. The truth, no matter how deep it is buried beneath the concrete, always finds a way to the surface. And sometimes, the monsters we spend our whole lives searching for turn out to be the people sleeping right next to us.